Have you ever looked at an ad and thought, this is way too good to be true? I should have trusted that instinct. I had just moved to the city, new job, new life, and I needed a cheap place to live, fast. Scrolling through Craigslist late one night, I found an ad. Spacious one-bedroom, $500 per month, utilities included. The photos looked weird, dimly lit, like someone took them on a flip phone. Still, I was desperate. The address was on the outskirts of town, secluded but quiet, the ad said. I emailed the landlord, and he replied within minutes. He wanted to meet me the next day. The next afternoon, I followed my GPS through winding roads until the houses grew sparse, and the trees seemed to close in. Finally, I found it, a small, pale house with peeling paint. There were no other cars around, no neighbors in sight. The landlord was waiting, a man in his 60s, pale and thin. He didn't say much, just smiled and ushered me inside. The place was off. The air was stale, like no one had lived there in years. The walls were cracked, and I swear I saw faint scratches leading down the hallway. Is there anyone else living here? I asked. He shook his head. It's all yours if you want it. Then I heard it, a thud muffled, coming from the locked door at the end of the hallway. Basement's off limits, he said quickly. His smile disappeared. I froze. Another thud, louder this time. Someone or something was down there. I made an excuse and left. As I walked back to my car, I turned to glance at the house and saw the curtain move. Someone was watching me leave. The moment I stepped inside, something felt wrong. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just this heaviness in the air. The apartment was eerily empty. No furniture, no decor, not even a smell. It felt like no one had lived there in years. I walked through the living room, my footsteps echoing faintly. That's when I noticed the details. There were scratches on the walls, deep, jagged marks, like someone had dragged something sharp across the plaster. They started at shoulder height and trailed downward, disappearing near the floor. I ran my fingers over them, uneasy. The kitchen was no better. Several cabinet doors were missing, and the ones that remained hung crookedly, as if they'd been yanked hard. I noticed the door to the pantry was completely gone, its hinges stripped bare. It's an old building, the landlord said quickly, like he could read my thoughts. I nodded, but my gut told me to leave. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere deeper inside. My eyes darted to the end of the hallway, where a single door stood closed. It didn't match the rest of the apartment. The wood looked newer, sturdier, and there was a heavy padlock on it. "What's that room?" I asked. The landlord stiffened. "Basement access. It's not part of the rental." The tapping stopped. For a moment, everything was silent, until a sound came again, soft but unmistakable. A muffled thud, like something shifting behind the door. I swallowed hard. "Is someone down there?" The landlord smiled faintly. "Don't worry about it." I couldn't move. My eyes stayed glued to that door as a chill crawled up my spine. Something was on the other side, and it knew I was there. I stood frozen, my gaze fixed on the locked door. The silence stretched, and just as I turned to walk away, I heard it breathing. Slow, heavy, ragged. It was unmistakable, like someone standing right on the other side of the door, inhaling and exhaling as if each breath took effort. My chest tightened. I glanced at the landlord, but he just smiled, his expression unsettlingly calm. "Are you sure no one's down there?" I stammered. His smile faded, replaced by something darker. "I told you, the basement's off limits." I took a step back, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think I've seen enough." But before I could move any farther, the landlord's hand shot out and gripped my arm, tightly. "Don't rush off," he said, his voice low and cold. "He's almost ready." My heart dropped. "Who's ready?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. He didn't answer. Instead, I heard the padlock click. not from being unlocked, but as if something on the other side had pulled at it. The breathing grew louder, echoing in the empty hallway, deep and labored. Panic hit me like a truck. I yanked my arm free and bolted for the front door. Behind me, I heard the landlord shouting, but I didn't dare look back. I threw the door open and sprinted to my car, my keys shaking in my hand as I tried to start the engine. As I sped away, I glanced at the house one last time. In the upstairs window, I saw it, a figure, tall and unmoving, staring down at me. I don't know who or what was almost ready, and I never want to find out. I didn't stop driving until I was back in the city, my hands trembling on the wheel. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that pale man, or worse, whatever was behind that door, following me. When I finally got back to my friend's apartment, I locked every door and window, sat on the couch, and tried to calm down. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the house. What had the landlord meant by "he's almost ready"? And that breathing, so heavy, so deliberate. Who was it coming from? I needed answers. I looked up the address online. It wasn't hard to find, but what I discovered made my blood run cold. The house had been vacant for over a decade. The previous owner, a man matching the landlord's description, had disappeared years ago under mysterious circumstances. Not knowing what else to do, I drove back to the neighborhood in the daylight, hoping to see if it had all just been in my head. That's when I noticed an elderly woman gardening a few houses down. I hesitated, then walked over and asked her about the property. Her face went pale the moment I mentioned it. "You didn't go in there, did you?" she whispered. I nodded slowly, my stomach knotting. She sighed shakily. "People come looking at that place every few months. Craigslist ads, too good to be true. And then they disappear. Police never find a trace." I felt the air leave my lungs. I asked her who placed the ads. She looked at me, eyes wide with fear. "No one knows. That house has been empty for years, but it's not alone. I didn't sleep for days. I deleted my Craigslist account and never searched for an apartment on there again. Some places are empty for a reason, and some doors should never be opened." Being a broke college student meant living on a tight budget. I had furnished most of my tiny apartment with hand-me-downs, thrift store finds, and, of course, Craigslist freebies. So when I saw an ad for a free couch just a few miles away in a quiet suburban neighborhood, it felt like my lucky day. The ad was simple. Free couch, great condition. First come, first served. Must pick up today. There was no photo, but I didn't think much of it. Free things go fast, and I didn't want to miss out. I emailed the poster, and within the hour, they replied with an address and a short message. "Come after 7 p.m. Knock twice. Back door." I remember hesitating for just a second. The wording was strange, but I shrugged it off. Maybe they didn't want to disturb their family during dinner or something. It wasn't uncommon for people to have quirks on Craigslist. Around 7:15 p.m., I pulled into the neighborhood. It was one of those places that looked perfectly normal by day, tree-lined streets, tidy lawns, but by night, it felt eerily quiet. Too quiet. I parked in the driveway of a small, run-down house at the end of the block. There were no lights on inside. I grabbed my phone and double-checked the address. It was correct. I thought about leaving right then and there, but I'd already driven out of my way, and part of me didn't want to give up on a free couch. So I walked around to the back of the house. The yard was overgrown, and the only light came from a single bulb above a rusted screen door. I knocked twice like the ad said. Nothing. I turned to leave, but then, from somewhere inside the house, I heard it, a creak, like footsteps slowly moving across the floor. And then a voice, low, muffled, called out, "Come in. It's unlocked." My stomach dropped. Something was very wrong. I froze for a moment outside the screen door, my hand hovering near the handle. The voice had come from inside the house, low and muffled, almost strained. "Come in. It's unlocked." I hesitated. The ad had said to use the back door, but the place felt abandoned. There were no lights on, no movement, nothing to suggest anyone actually lived there. I glanced around the yard, just tall, unkempt grass and an old shed that looked ready to collapse. The silence was suffocating, but then I thought, maybe they're in a rush. Maybe they're just in another room. I told myself I was overthinking it. After all, I had already driven all this way for a free couch. So, against my better judgment, I pushed the door open. The house smelled wrong. It was a mix of mildew, something rotten, and that old, stale air you only find in places no one's been in for years. My shoes stuck slightly to the floor with each step, the linoleum tacky underfoot. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. The kitchen I'd walked into was completely bare except for an old wooden table shoved against the far wall. The walls had yellowing patches where pictures must have once hung, and the windows were covered with thick, dark curtains. That's when I noticed something odd, a pair of muddy shoes sitting near the doorway to the living room. They were large, far too big for me, and they looked freshly worn. I heard movement again, a slow, dragging sound from deeper in the house. It sent chills crawling up my spine. "Hello? I'm here for the couch," I said, louder this time. Silence. I spied the couch through the doorway. It sat in the middle of a bare living room, and from where I stood, it looked off. The cushions were lumpy, like something heavy was underneath them. The longer I stared, the more I was certain I could see a faint outline, like someone had been sitting there moments before. A cold breeze hit me, and I turned quickly. The back door, the one I'd just come through, was closed. That's when I heard it again. From behind me, a voice whispered, closer this time, "Don't go yet. I need help with the couch." I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty, completely empty. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled back from the couch. My hands shook uncontrollably as I felt around beneath the cushions. That's when my fingers grazed something cold, slick. A piece of paper. I pulled it out slowly. My heart slammed against my ribcage as I unfolded it. The note was written in messy, frantic handwriting. "Please don't take it. He'll follow you home." A chill swept over me. I dropped the note onto the floor. My vision blurred as I tried to process what I had just read. Who was this he? What was following me? Just as I reached for my phone to call someone, I heard it again, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from above. Thump, thump, thump. They weren't coming from just one set of feet. There were multiple. Too many. They sounded heavy, uneven, like something or someone was dragging themselves across the floor. Panic surged through my body, and my fight-or-flight instinct kicked in. I turned toward the front door, my mind screaming at me to get out. Fast. But as I reached for the doorknob, I heard something else. Whispers. They were faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. Whispers coming from upstairs. "Don't leave. Stay." My breath caught in my throat, and I froze in place. My vision darted from the closed door to the staircase at the end of the hallway. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like a crowd, many voices, all murmuring the same thing. "Stay, stay." I couldn't think. My body moved on instinct. I bolted toward the door, yanking it open with all my strength. Outside, the cool night air hit me, but I didn't slow down. I ran to my car as fast as my legs could carry me. Once I was inside, I locked every door and window, my hands still trembling. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rear-view mirror. There was no one there. Still, I knew I wasn't safe. That couch? I left it behind, and I never looked back. Whatever was upstairs, I pray I never find out. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the note again. "Please don't take it. He'll follow you home." and heard the footsteps from upstairs echoing through my mind. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home. My apartment felt wrong, empty, as if the air itself was heavier. I checked every window, locked every door, and double-checked that nothing was out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. By midday, I couldn't sit still any longer. My phone buzzed relentlessly with texts from friends, but I ignored them all. My thoughts were consumed with the house, the free couch, and whatever had been lurking inside. I needed answers. I went back to the neighborhood, this time in broad daylight. The house was exactly where I'd left it. The overgrown yard, the peeling paint, the lifeless windows. But something about it felt even more ominous now. I walked up to the door, hesitating before knocking. No one answered. Frustrated, I walked around the side of the house to the backyard. That's when I saw them. 2 officers standing beside a patrol car, looking over the property. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. One of the officers glanced at me, his expression serious. "We've been getting complaints from people saying they've disappeared after picking up furniture here." I froze. "Disappeared?" He nodded. "This house has been linked to several missing persons cases over the last few years. They all went inside for free items, couches, beds, and never came back." My stomach twisted. The officer handed me a flyer with a photo of someone I recognized. It was a girl from my college, Sarah. She had been reported missing 3 weeks ago after answering an ad for a free dining table in the same neighborhood. I sank onto the ground, unable to speak. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Whatever I had walked into wasn't just some creepy coincidence. It was something much darker. The officer crouched down next to me, his voice soft. "You're lucky you got out. Some don't." I didn't go back to that house. I couldn't. And though I moved apartments soon after, the memory of that night still haunts me. Whatever was behind that couch, whatever he was, it's something I hope never crosses my path again. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. Just a few days in a secluded cabin in the woods, far away from the noise of the city. My friends and I had rented a cabin on Craigslist, something cheap and off the beaten path. The photos looked perfect. A rustic, charming wooden cabin surrounded by nothing but trees. We thought it would be the perfect escape. When we arrived, the place didn't seem as inviting as the pictures. The driveway was unkempt, covered in fallen leaves and branches. The cabin itself looked worn, with a sagging roof and warped wooden planks. There was a sense of neglect, but we chalked it up to the remote location. The owners probably didn't spend much time there anymore. The inside was just as strange. The rooms were sparsely furnished, and a strange, musty smell lingered in the air. But it wasn't until nightfall that things began to feel off. We were sitting around the fireplace, laughing and telling stories, when we heard it, a faint, barely audible scratching sound coming from the walls. It started slow, like a light tapping, but as the night deepened, the sound grew louder. "Scratch! Scratch!" "Did you guys hear that?" one of my friends whispered. We all froze, listening intently. The scratching wasn't coming from outside. It was definitely inside the walls. My other friend grabbed a flashlight and shined it around the room, but nothing seemed out of place. "Maybe it's an old house settling," I said, though my voice trembled. But the scratching continued, growing more insistent as the hours passed. We tried to ignore it, laughing nervously to cover the fear rising inside us, but the sound wasn't going away. Around midnight, we decided to turn in for the night. As I lay in the dimly lit bedroom, my mind raced with uneasy thoughts. That's when I heard it again, closer this time. Tap, tap, tap. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside the room. I sat up slowly, heart pounding in my chest. The flashlight flickered in my hand as I scanned the room. The scratching was almost deafening now, relentless. Suddenly I saw it. A shadow moved across the wall, a tall, thin figure. It wasn't outside the window. It was inside the room with us. My breath caught, and I screamed. The scream echoed through the cabin, shattering the tense silence. My friends jolted awake, their eyes wide with fear. The scratching had stopped, but the shadow was still there, looming in the corner of the room. I fumbled with the flashlight, my hands shaking as I aimed it at the spot where I had seen the figure. But there was nothing, just a bare wall. Where is it?" one of my friends whispered hoarsely. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. Now, we rushed to our feet, grabbing our bags and jackets in a frantic panic. The front door seemed miles away as we burst out into the cold night air. The cabin loomed behind us, a silent, foreboding presence. The woods beyond were dark, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Breathing heavily, we stood there for a few minutes, listening. The silence felt heavier than before, too still. No more scratching, no shadow. But something inside me told me that it wasn't over. "We can't go back in," I said firmly, my voice steadying as adrenaline began to fade. "We need to get out of here. Now." As we hurried toward the car, we noticed something strange. The headlights flickered once before illuminating a figure in the distance, standing at the edge of the woods. It wasn't human, at least, not in the way we understood. The figure was tall, unnaturally thin, with long, spindly limbs that moved unnaturally. It didn't walk. Its movements were more like a slithering motion, almost too fluid to be real. The glow of the headlights caught its hollow, sunken eyes, and a low, guttural sound escaped its lips, something that wasn't a scream or a word, but an unearthly wail. "No!" one of my friends screamed, breaking the stillness. "We can't stay here." I punched the ignition, the car roared to life, and we peeled out of the driveway, leaving the cabin and whatever it was behind. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest gas station miles down the road. My hands were still trembling as I filled the tank, while my friends huddled together in the back seat, their faces pale and haunted. "We have to report this," one of them said, her voice cracking. "They need to know what's going on there." I nodded numbly, knowing she was right. But deep down, I knew that whatever we told the authorities wouldn't change what we had seen. Some things aren't meant to be understood. They're just meant to be left alone. The cabin, it'll stay in the woods, untouched and forgotten. Some places were never meant to be found. The car roared down the empty, winding road, the sound of gravel crunching beneath the tires echoing in the still night. None of us spoke. The air inside the car was thick with terror. Every shadow that passed in the headlights seemed to loom larger, every turn in the road more ominous. I think we lost it," one of my friends whispered hoarsely after a while. Her voice was barely audible over the hum of the engine. I didn't trust my voice to reply. Every part of me screamed that whatever we had seen was still out there, watching, waiting. The eerie silence of the woods, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves, felt suffocating. After what felt like hours, we finally spotted a dim glow in the distance, a gas station. The relief was instant as we pulled in, and I let out a shaky breath, cutting the engine. My hands were still trembling, and I couldn't seem to stop them. "Let's call the cops," one of my friends urged. "They need to do something." Still, the thought of going back to the authorities felt futile. What could they do against something like that? Whatever it wasn't human. It defied logic, defied reality. We stepped out of the car, the cool night air offering little comfort. The station attendant eyed us warily as we approached the payphone. My fingers fumbled as I dialed, my mind a whirlwind of panic. 911, what's your emergency?" a calm, collected voice answered. I began, my voice catching in my throat. We were at a cabin off Maplewood Road. Something was in there. It wasn't human. It had no face, no eyes, just something wrong. There was a pause on the line. "Maplewood Road? That area is abandoned. No one's lived there for years." My breath hitched, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. "That's not possible," I said desperately. "We were just there. It's real." Suddenly, the phone went dead. I stared at it, confusion and terror mixing into a suffocating concoction. "What do we do now?" one of my friends whispered. Before I could answer, we heard it again. That low, guttural wail. This time, it was closer, too close. We turned in unison, hearts pounding. The dim light of the gas station flickered ominously. There it was, standing at the edge of the parking lot, just outside the reach of the light. Its tall, shadowy form moved with unnatural ease, its limbs twisting unnaturally as it advanced toward us. "No!" I screamed, backing away, but it was relentless. There was no escape. Everything seemed to blur. Time, reality. And then the shadow was upon us. Its wail rose to a deafening crescendo as it loomed over us, a nightmare silhouette against the dim glow of the gas station lights. I closed my eyes tightly, bracing for what came next. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. The wail faded into the distance, leaving only silence behind. When I opened my eyes, there was nothing but empty darkness once more. We didn't stay at the gas station. We couldn't. The eerie silence that followed the shadow's disappearance felt worse than its presence. Every second felt like an eternity, each breath shallow and rushed as we rushed to the car once more. The drive back was quiet, each mile passing in a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. We couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with us, watching, lingering just out of sight. By dawn, we were back in the city, the familiar streets and lights offering little comfort. We parked at my friend's place, too afraid to return to our own homes. None of us wanted to be alone. The sun rising over the city was a false sense of security. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that the shadow was following us, that its presence was imprinted into the fabric of the night. Every knock at the door, every distant car horn, sent a shiver down my spine. Days passed, but the fear didn't fade. We filed a report with the police, though we knew they'd find nothing. The cabin was abandoned, and the story seemed too unbelievable to anyone who hadn't been there. Yet, we couldn't escape the memories. In the weeks following, strange things began to happen. Small, unsettling occurrences. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, doors creaking open on their own, and the low wail echoing in my dreams. One night, after falling into an uneasy sleep, I woke to see it, the shadow, standing at the edge of my bedroom. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and that haunting wail filled the room again. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I was paralyzed by fear. The shadow tilted its head slowly, its twisted limbs extending unnaturally. It didn't speak, didn't make a sound, yet the message was clear. I was not alone. Desperate, I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and hurled it toward the shadow. It passed through the figure like a phantom, and the shadow dissipated into the darkness. When morning came, I was alone in my room once more. My heart pounded, but the fear remained. It wasn't over. The rental cabin had reached beyond the woods and into our very lives. Whatever had followed us wasn't something that could be escaped so easily. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, but sometimes they refuse to be forgotten. It was a typical Monday morning, and like every other day, I was scrolling through job listings on Craigslist. My current job wasn't paying the bills, and I was desperate for something new, anything that could help me get by. That's when I came across it, a posting for an odd jobs position. The description was vague, offering a generous pay rate for simple tasks. No interview required, just a call to set things up. Curiosity got the better of me. I dialed the number provided, and a calm, monotone voice answered on the other end. "Are you available for immediate work?" I hesitated, but something about the offer appealed to me. "Yes," I said slowly. "I'm available The voice instructed me to meet at a quiet address on the outskirts of town. It wasn't a typical business location, but I figured it was nothing unusual for Craigslist postings. The house was dark, windows obscured by heavy curtains. It sat at the end of a narrow dirt road, secluded from the main street. When I knocked, no one answered. After a few minutes, the door creaked open slowly. A man stood there, thin, pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to gaze straight through me. "You're here for the job," he said flatly. I nodded. "Yes." He gestured inside, and I followed him into the dimly lit house. The air was cold, stale, and carried a strange metallic tang. The inside was empty. No furniture, no decorations, just bare, cold walls and flickering light bulbs. It felt oppressive, like something was watching from the shadows. "Sit," the man said, motioning to a chair. His voice was calm, yet it sent shivers down my spine. I took a seat, my hands gripping the armrest tightly. "So, what do I need to do?" He gave a slight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Nothing complicated. Just keep the house clean, keep the lights on, and never let anyone inside." I frowned. That's it," he confirmed, his voice monotonous. "You'll be paid handsomely." Before I could ask any more questions, he left the room without another word. I sat there for what felt like hours, the silence stretching unbearably. The sound of my own breath seemed loud in the stillness. Something wasn't right about this place. The door remained unlocked, yet there was a strange sense of confinement. Shadows moved against the walls, shapes shifting just beyond the edge of vision. The flickering light bulb above me seemed ready to go out at any moment. I wanted to leave, desperately, but the thought of leaving behind whatever was lurking in the dark terrified me even more. I didn't know what I had gotten myself into, and I knew I couldn't leave now. Time dragged on inside the dark, windowless house. Every second felt heavier than the last. The man who had hired me never returned, leaving me alone with the oppressive silence. I tried pacing the room, desperate to stay busy, but the feeling of being watched never left. The flickering light bulb above cast long, distorted shadows across the walls. They seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally, moving with a mind of their own. I would look away, only to glance back and see the shapes rearranging themselves again. It was as if the shadows were alive, watching, waiting. I considered leaving. The front door was unlocked, just as the man had said. But every time I reached for the handle, a wave of cold dread washed over me, making my limbs stiffen. Something inside the house seemed to resist my departure, holding me in place like an invisible force. Hours passed. I kept the house clean, sweeping the floors, wiping down surfaces, but the grime and dust returned as soon as I turned my back. No matter how much effort I put into maintaining the place, it seemed to return to its neglected state as if nothing I did mattered. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of electricity and the faint sound of something shifting in the walls. I began to hear whispers, soft, breathy voices just out of earshot. Each time I tried to focus, the whispers grew louder, though still unintelligible. Desperate for answers, I tried to call the man again, but the number went straight to voicemail. No matter how many times I dialed, he didn't answer. And then the knocking began. It started slow, a rhythmic tapping that echoed through the empty house. At first, I thought it might be the wind or some animal outside, but as the knocking intensified, I knew better. It wasn't from the outside. It was coming from inside the house. I moved toward the sound, heart pounding in my chest. The knocking came from one particular wall, cold, hollow, and relentless. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. No response. Only the echo of my own fear reverberated through the room. A chill ran down my spine. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the room with a chorus of unintelligible voices. They seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding me, suffocating me in a thick, unnatural fog. Panic surged through me as I sprinted toward the door, my mind screaming for escape. But as my hand reached for the handle, something or someone gripped it tightly from the other side. I froze. The cold, bony grip tightened, pulling the door slowly inward as the knocking continued to echo inside the walls. This was no ordinary house. It had swallowed me whole, and now it wasn't going to let me go. The door slammed open with a deafening crash, but no one was there. The grip that had held it vanished into the shadows, leaving the house eerily quiet once more. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled backward, pressing myself against the cold wall. The knocking had stopped, but the silence was worse. I could feel the weight of whatever had been behind that door lingering, its presence lingering in the room with a palpable, oppressive intensity. The whispers grew louder again, surrounding me in a symphony of hushed voices. What are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. The words felt useless, like speaking into the void. Suddenly, a voice spoke, smooth, low, and unsettlingly familiar. "You're still here," it said, coming from somewhere deeper within the house. I froze. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice more forceful now despite the terror clawing at my chest. "You agreed to stay," it whispered back. "To do as I asked. You were warned." I didn't know what I was getting into. I cried, my voice trembling with frustration and fear. "Let me out!" The house didn't respond. The shadows stretched again, shifting unnaturally, and a new shape began to form, tall, gaunt, and hollow-eyed. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Its movements were too fluid, too alien, and the air around it seemed to grow colder with each step it took toward me. "You're a part of it now," the voice murmured. "You'll never leave." My mind raced. I couldn't think straight. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body was frozen, incapable of movement. The figure stepped closer, its grotesque silhouette towering over me. The whispers were deafening now, an overwhelming cacophony of incomprehensible sounds that threatened to tear my sanity apart. Then, from deep within the house, a sound pierced through the chaos, a child's laughter. The laughter echoed through the halls, small and sweet but deeply unsettling. It wasn't the laughter of a living child. It was something ancient, something inhuman. "No," I whispered, shaking my head frantically. "Stop, please." The figure seemed amused, its hollow eyes gleaming with a sick, twisted satisfaction. "You can't stop it," it said, its voice a haunting whisper. "It's already here." The house trembled as the laughter grew louder, more insistent. The walls seemed alive, shifting around me, pressing closer as if they were closing in. Panic surged again, stronger than before. I fought against the force binding me to the room, but it was no use. Darkness consumed me. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't sure how much time had passed. The house was empty once more, silent as a tomb. The whispers and laughter had stopped. The oppressive presence was gone, at least for now. But I knew it wasn't over. Not really. Whatever had taken hold of that house had left its mark on me, and I would carry it with me, haunting my every step. Some nightmares don't end when you wake up. They follow you no matter where you go. Days turned into weeks, but the haunting images of that house refused to leave my mind. The job posting, the dark figure, the oppressive presence, it was all too real, etched into my memory like a brand. Even though the house was no longer in my sight, the fear lingered. I tried to return to my normal life, but it was impossible. Nightmares plagued my sleep, and strange things began happening around me. Objects moved on their own, whispers followed me wherever I went, and the feeling of being watched was a constant weight pressing down on my shoulders. Desperate for answers, I reached out to a friend who had done some research into the supernatural. Together, we pored over every theory, every account of strange occurrences linked to mysterious Craigslist jobs. The more we dug, the clearer it became, this wasn't isolated. There were others. People who had answered similar postings, only to vanish without a trace or return forever changed. They described the same oppressive atmosphere, shadowy figures, and unsettling whispers. Their accounts were all eerily similar, each story blending into the next like pieces of a horrifying puzzle. One night, unable to shake the feeling of impending doom, I returned to the address of the house. The streets were eerily quiet. The familiar road, seeming darker than I remembered. The house stood just as it did before, abandoned, yet somehow alive. I approached cautiously, scanning the surroundings for signs of life. The windows remained black, no movement inside. Yet, I knew it wasn't empty. That malevolent force still resided within. Taking a deep breath, I forced the door open. It groaned in protest, as if the house itself was resisting my presence. The musty air rushed out in waves, thick and heavy. Shadows slithered along the walls, shifting like twisted tendrils, and the whispers returned, low, guttural, and distorted. "I won't run," I whispered into the darkness. My voice trembled, but there was no turning back now. "I'll face you." The house shook as if in response. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the rooms, followed by an unnatural screech that sent shivers down my spine. Shadows twisted into the figure again, tall, faceless, and terrifying, and it began to advance toward me once more. "You're bound to me," it hissed. "You'll never be free." "I decide my fate," I countered, voice firm despite my fear. "Not you." The figure stopped, momentarily caught off guard. The oppressive weight lessened, but only for a moment. The whispers intensified, louder than before, wrapping around me like a noose. Suddenly, the house trembled violently. Cracks formed in the walls, and a blinding light erupted from the floorboards. The figure shrieked, its unnatural form dissolving into the growing brightness. "Enough!" I screamed, pushing forward into the light. For a moment, everything went white, and then silence. When I awoke, I was alone. The house was gone, vanished without a trace. The streets were normal again, the air fresh and free from the oppressive darkness. Yet, deep inside, I knew the horror wasn't over. The house might be gone, but the mark it left on me would never fully fade. Some nightmares are like scars, they heal, but they still haunt you. It was supposed to be a simple Craigslist pickup. A young woman, Jessica, scrolling through the site late one evening. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just passing the time. That's when she saw it. A post for a free item, a dollhouse. The description was sparse, offering no details about where it was located or why it was free. Just a cryptic note, free dollhouse. Must take immediately. Jessica was intrigued. She had always loved antiques, and something about the mystery of it tugged at her curiosity. She emailed the seller and received a quick response with an address. "Pick it up tonight," the message said simply. No questions asked. The location was out of the way, down a long, winding road that led to the edge of the forest. Jessica parked her car in front of an old, decrepit house, its windows shattered and vines creeping up the walls. The sight alone sent a chill down her spine. But Jessica was undeterred. She approached the house and knocked on the door. After a few moments of silence, it creaked open, revealing an empty, darkened hallway. The dollhouse was sitting in the corner of the room, covered by a tattered old sheet. Jessica removed the sheet slowly, revealing the tiny house. It was beautiful in its own eerie way. Dolls placed in perfect, lifelike poses inside each room, their glassy eyes staring blankly into nothingness. Every detail was immaculate, from the tiny furniture to the miniature books on the shelves. But there was something unsettling about it. The dollhouse didn't feel right. Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, even though she was alone. The room felt colder now, the silence oppressive. As Jessica packed the dollhouse into her car, the house seemed to shift slightly in her peripheral vision. She turned back quickly, but the room was empty once more. The sense of unease only deepened. That night, as Jessica brought the dollhouse into her bedroom and set it up on her nightstand, she felt an odd weight settle in the room. The air grew heavier with every passing minute, and the soft creaks of the house settling echoed unnaturally in her ears. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt a cold breath against her cheek and heard the faintest whispering, tiny, almost inaudible voices murmuring from the dollhouse. It was as if the dolls inside weren't merely inanimate figures, but something more alive. Jessica clutched the covers tightly, fear gnawing at her. She tried to convince herself it was all in her head, that the stories she read about haunted objects were nonsense. But deep down, she knew better. Something had followed her home, and it wasn't going away. The following days were restless for Jessica. Every time she walked past the dollhouse in her bedroom, an unsettling sense of discomfort would creep over her. The tiny dolls inside seemed to move ever so slightly, their lifeless eyes watching her from behind the miniature windows. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew something was off. The whispers continued, soft, haunting murmurs that echoed inside her mind. They grew louder at night, barely audible at first, but soon becoming a constant presence. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts tangled in the eerie sound. It wasn't a language she could understand, but it wasn't random either. There was meaning behind the whispers, something dark and insidious. Jessica moved the dollhouse off her nightstand and placed it on a shelf across the room, hoping it would separate her from the unsettling presence. Yet, no matter where she placed it, the same feeling of being watched followed her. Shadows danced across the walls even when the room was bathed in light. She felt a chilling air no amount of heaters could dispel. One night, Jessica woke up abruptly. The whispers were louder than ever, and a cold, bony hand seemed to brush her hair, followed by a faint giggle. She shot upright in bed, gasping for breath, only to find nothing but silence in the stillness of her dark bedroom. Her anxiety began to spiral. She tried to leave the house, go somewhere safe, but no matter how far she traveled, the feeling of the dollhouse haunted her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the dolls, grinning in their twisted, lifeless poses, as though they were waiting for her. Determined to get answers, Jessica researched the history of the dollhouse. She learned that the house was once owned by an elderly woman who used to create detailed miniature homes for her late daughter, a child who had passed away tragically years ago. The woman's grief had become so consuming that it seemed she began to use the dolls as vessels for her sorrow. When she passed away, the dollhouse was left behind, untouched for decades. This history only fueled Jessica's fear. The thought of spirits or emotions trapped within the dolls seemed terrifyingly plausible. The whispers grew stronger, more demanding. The dolls seemed to shift positions on their own, and occasionally, their expressions twisted into something more sinister, evil, even. Jessica became paranoid. Her friends noticed her constant unease and sleepless nights. But no matter how much she tried to explain, no one could truly understand what she was experiencing. She didn't sleep at all some nights, unable to tear her gaze away from the dollhouse. One evening, as Jessica sat in the dimly lit room, the dolls inside the house began to move in unison, small, deliberate gestures. They stood up slowly, their glassy eyes locked onto her, their expressions twisted into grotesque, haunting smiles. Jessica backed away from the shelf, terror bubbling over. "No! Stay away!" she screamed, but the dolls continued to advance, one tiny step at a time. The whispers became deafening once more, filling the room with an oppressive, overwhelming force. Jessica knew then that there was no escape. The dollhouse had consumed her, and it wasn't finished yet. Jessica's heart pounded against her chest as the dolls continued to move, their tiny hands reaching toward her with unsettling precision. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in on her as she frantically searched for an escape. But no matter how far she tried to retreat, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening her with their eerie, incessant murmur. "Stop!" she cried, her voice trembling with fear. "Please, leave me alone." The dolls' faces twisted into grotesque, expressionless masks, their eyes hollow and lifeless, yet filled with an unnatural malevolence. Jessica stumbled back into the corner of the room, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Every muscle in her body felt frozen, paralyzed by the overwhelming terror. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the room was plunged into darkness. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic tapping of the dolls' feet against the wooden floor as they slowly moved closer. Jessica could feel their cold, tiny hands grazing her skin, their grip like a vice tightening around her. "No, no, no," she screamed, struggling to break free from the grasp of the malevolent figures. Her voice cracked as desperation consumed her. She clawed at the darkness, reaching blindly for anything that could offer her protection. A weapon, a doorway, a window. But nothing was there. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, a sudden crash echoed through the house. The dolls stopped mid-motion, their eyes flickering like dying flames. Jessica froze in place, straining her ears to catch any sound. The whispers, once loud and insistent, faded into a haunting silence. The lights flickered again, flickering erratically before finally stabilizing. Jessica's breath was shallow, her body trembling uncontrollably. She dared not move, staring at the motionless dolls, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Slowly, the dolls began to retreat, their small bodies turning and walking back toward the dollhouse. The room felt lighter now, the oppressive weight lifted. Jessica remained rooted to the floor, her eyes locked on the unsettling figures as they disappeared into the tiny house once more. The whispers had vanished entirely. The oppressive darkness lifted, leaving Jessica alone in the dim light of her bedroom. Her breath came in ragged, uneven gulps as she collapsed onto the floor, hugging her knees to her chest. She whispered hoarsely, her voice trembling with both fear and relief. "I'm safe." But as she tried to calm her frantic thoughts, a soft creak echoed behind her. A voice, barely a whisper, yet unmistakable. "Not yet," it said. Jessica spun around, her breath catching in her throat. Nothing was there. The room was still, but the chill had returned. A sense of unease settled deep into her bones. The dollhouse sat silently across the room, its tiny windows staring back at her as if it were watching, waiting for the next time. Jessica knew the battle wasn't over. Whatever had taken hold of that dollhouse was far from finished, and no matter how hard she tried to escape, it would always be there, lurking in the shadows. Some horrors never truly leave you. They follow you, always watching, always waiting. Jessica sat alone in the silence of her now empty house. The dollhouse was gone, destroyed beyond recognition. She had smashed it piece by piece, driven by a desperate need to sever the unsettling connection that had formed between them. Yet, no matter how thoroughly she destroyed it, the fear still lingered. Her hands trembled as she poured herself a glass of water, but the cold stillness of the house refused to dissipate. Shadows played along the corners of the room, stretching unnaturally long and thin. The whispers had stopped for now, but Jessica knew they could return at any moment. It wasn't just the dollhouse that had haunted her. Something had attached itself to her. The oppressive presence had seeped into her thoughts, her dreams, and even the way she saw the world around her. It wasn't a fear of the supernatural anymore. It was a fear of the unknown, something dark and insidious that couldn't easily be contained. Every noise became suspect. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper on the wind. Jessica began avoiding the places where she once felt safest, constantly feeling eyes upon her, watching her every move. The world seemed colder, more distant, as if the dollhouse had opened a door to something far worse than mere dolls and shadows. She reached out to friends and family, sharing her story. At first, they believed her. Her paranoia was justified, her terror palpable. But as the days wore on, They began to doubt her. The experiences seemed too surreal, too impossible. They urged her to seek professional help, convinced her mind had unraveled from the stress. Jessica went along with it, seeing therapists who listened patiently, but never truly understood the depth of her fear. No amount of logic or reasoning could quiet the nightmares that plagued her nights. The visions of twisted, lifeless dolls moving in the dark, their tiny, malevolent hands reaching for her. Months passed, and the world around her slowly dulled. She secluded herself, cutting ties with anyone who couldn't comprehend the horror that had invaded her life. Even in the safety of her own home, the shadows seemed to grow thicker, darker, as if feeding off her vulnerability. One night, while sitting in the same room where the dollhouse once stood, Jessica found a message scrawled across the wall in a dark, red substance. A message she couldn't comprehend. The letters were illegible, yet they seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The whispers began again. This time, they were louder than before, clearer. They demanded her attention, her fear, her soul. Jessica could feel the weight of whatever force had followed her pressing against her chest, choking her breath, suffocating her from within. She realized then, with a terrifying certainty, that the dollhouse hadn't been an isolated event. Whatever had been trapped within it wasn't gone. It was growing stronger. In a final act of desperation, Jessica reached out to a historian who specialized in the occult. She poured her heart out, sharing everything: the dollhouse, the whispers, the fear, and begged for answers. The historian listened intently, his eyes dark with understanding. "Some things can't be destroyed," he told her solemnly. "Once they're awakened, they leave a mark. A part of them remains." Jessica grasped at his words, hoping for comfort, but none came. She realized that her fight was far from over. The dollhouse had been only the beginning, a gateway to something much darker. And that darkness was far from finished with her. It was a rainy evening when Alex stumbled upon a peculiar Craigslist ad. The title read, "Invitation to a private gathering. Must RSVP by midnight." The description was sparse, just a vague mention of a secluded event in a lavish old mansion, promising an exclusive experience. Intrigued by the mystery, Alex felt drawn to it, despite the odd nature of the invite. With little information to go on, Alex felt a strange pull to respond. He composed a simple message: "Will attend." A reply came almost instantly. "Details will follow. Be ready by 11 p.m. At 11 p.m., the clock ticked on, its steady beat hammering into Alex's nerves. He drove through winding streets until he arrived at the mansion, an imposing, Gothic structure shrouded in darkness. The driveway was overgrown with ivy, and the windows glowed faintly with an eerie, unnatural light. The front door creaked open on its own as Alex stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and mildew. He was greeted by a butler in a tattered suit, who barely spoke a word but motioned for him to follow. The grand hall was filled with other guests, their faces pale and expressionless. The room was lavishly decorated, but the beauty of it all was tainted by an unsettling silence. Soft whispers hummed in the background, inaudible yet persistent. "Welcome," a voice echoed through the hall. A deep, unsettling voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You've been chosen. The gathering begins soon." Alex glanced around, uneasy, his skin crawling with the sensation that he wasn't truly alone. The other guests moved with an unnatural grace, their eyes hollow and their movements too precise, too rehearsed. There was something wrong with them, something fundamentally inhuman. The whispers grew louder, now carrying words, ominous, sinister, and haunting. Alex felt trapped in the room, unable to speak or move. He was aware that everyone around him was in the same state, frozen by a shared terror. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the mansion like a death knell. The room went dark, save for the faint flickering of candles that had appeared on the long banquet table at the center of the hall. From the shadows, figures began to emerge, dressed in ornate, grotesque masks. their faces twisted into malevolent grins, their movements deliberate and unnatural. Alex's breath caught in his throat as he realized they were not human. What is this?" Alex whispered, his voice barely audible over the mounting chaos. "You're here," the deep voice hissed once again, "because you've accepted. There is no turning back." The guests, the figures, the whispers, they all began to close in on him. He felt the weight of their presence crushing him, their eyes burning into his very soul. Alex's fear reached a fever pitch, his screams lost in the overwhelming noise of the gathering. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the lights flickered once more, revealing the room empty, save for Alex, who lay unconscious on the floor. The mansion was silent again, its grandeur tainted by the sinister events that had just unfolded. Hours passed before Alex woke, alone in the dark. His head throbbed and his body ached. He staggered to his feet, his mind foggy and disoriented, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The whispers still echoed in his mind, their haunting words lingering long after the event had ended. The grand hall was still, but the memory of the grotesque figures and the deep, unsettling voice haunted him. He made his way through the empty mansion, calling out for anyone, but no answer came. The house was lifeless as the memories that clung to the walls. When he searched the internet for details of the gathering, nothing was found. No reports, no history, no trace of the mansion or the grotesque figures. It was as if it had never existed, leaving Alex alone with the memory of a nightmare that could never be explained. The next few days were a blur. Alex struggled to maintain his grip on reality, consumed by the haunting visions that haunted his waking hours. The gathering was imprinted in his mind like a scar, and the whispers echoed whenever he closed his eyes. He sought solace in therapy, but no words could soothe the terror that coursed through him. Every time he tried to speak about the event, his voice would falter, caught between the need to communicate and the fear of confronting what had happened. His friends and family began to notice the shift in him. Alex became more withdrawn, paranoid, always glancing over his shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that something or someone was watching him. His usual humor was replaced with a haunted silence that no one could breach. One evening, unable to sleep, Alex sat alone in his study, surrounded by books and notes he had been feverishly compiling about the mansion and the gathering. His research led him down a twisted rabbit hole of legends and forgotten tales, each one darker than the last. He discovered accounts of similar events in other secluded locations, gatherings that defied reason and rational explanation. Stories of masked figures, cryptic voices, and ancient rituals whispered through time. The mansion in his nightmare wasn't unique. It had its roots in a long history of the occult, hidden from the modern world's prying eyes. Alex's resolve hardened as he delved deeper into the truth. He realized that what he had witnessed was not merely a strange cult or a nightmare. It was something far older, far darker, a ritual rooted in forgotten realms of human history, where reality bends and the impossible takes form. As he pored over ancient manuscripts and old, weathered journals, Alex began piecing together fragments of a dark tapestry. The mansion had once been the center of a secret society, bound by ancient contracts and rituals that transcended mortal comprehension. Over time, the society faded into obscurity, but its remnants continued to haunt the mansion, feeding off the fear and desperation of unwitting victims like him. Days turned into weeks, and Alex's understanding grew. He understood that the invitation was no mere chance. He had been chosen, drawn into a trap that had been waiting for centuries. The whispers had been warnings all along, subtle reminders of the price he would pay if he dared to accept. There was no going back. The mansion's hold on him had taken root, twisting his perception of reality until he could no longer trust his own mind. The figures and masks weren't just figments of his imagination. They were manifestations of something ancient, something beyond comprehension. Alex knew that to escape, he had to destroy the mansion entirely, burn it to the ground, sever the connection, and let the past finally rest. But even as he formulated his plan, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. Could he really escape? Could anyone truly break free from a curse so deeply entwined with the fabric of history? On the eve of his final confrontation, Alex stood before the mansion one last time. The rain fell harder now, washing away the modern world, leaving only the dark and forgotten place where his nightmare had begun. He whispered a silent prayer, a desperate plea to whatever forces still lurk within. As the mansion burned, the flames consuming every shadow and memory, Alex knew he was free. But the cost was unimaginable. His sanity, his past, his life as he once knew it, all lost in the inferno. Yet, even in his triumph, a lingering fear remained. For the mansion still existed in the minds of others, whispered in dark corners and hidden in forgotten places. And though Alex was free, he knew that the invitation would always wait for another soul desperate enough to accept.